I think the real question that we want to get to in your presentation is sort of how the work of the Quality Education Model of the Quality Education Commission can inform the Oregon Education Investment Board's investment decisions, and have a rather long history with the QEM. And
I'm Susan Massey. I live in Coos Bay, and I'm chairing the commission right now. And I've met many of you, but others that are strangers to me. And it's just a delight to be here today and to be able to talk about this very thing. You can imagine there's been some anxiety on the commission about where we would land in the scheme of things when it's all sorted out. And I'm not sure that anyone can answer that question right now. But it is of utmost importance to me that the functions of the commission continue. I believe the functions that we've been charged to do are very important, even in this new paradigm. And whether the commission does them or whether the OEIB takes on those functions, I believe the functions are very important. The special aspect of the commission, I believe, is the fact that it is somewhat independent of the political system and stands to be an independent voice as it produces its report for the governor and policymakers each 2 years. I think that that independence has a lot of value and is something that might be kept in mind. Brian Reeder's going to be doing the heavy lifting on the presentation. He's just a wonderful staff person, and I'm glad he's here today. And he's prepared to talk to you about what the commission is and what it does.
Governor Kitzhaber, members of the board, Brian Reeder with the Department of Education, also have been staff to the Quality Education Commission for I guess close to 10 years now. While I'm getting the PowerPoint booted up here, just some sort of preliminary remarks. I think the Quality Education Model was built initially back in 1997-98 time period, and the purpose was really to give us a sense of what resources it would take if all of our schools use best practices to meet the education goals that are in statute. And the way the commission defined that back at the time, and actually the commission didn't officially exist as a commission back then, but the way that was defined was to get roughly 90% of our students to meet state benchmarks. Now, we're trying to shoot a little bit higher these days, and the model's been criticized for setting the bar at only 90%, but that discussion, I think, is probably not a terribly useful one to have. The point of the model was really to estimate the resource needs for accomplishing our goals, and that, in some sense, was a mistake. I think what happened was that number was so high that people not only dismissed it as feasible, but they dismissed the model as a tool. And that's the unfortunate part of this, that the model isn't useful because the number that comes out of it is so high. So what we did in the last roughly 7 or 8 years was make the model more useful by putting a lot more detail into it so that it could provide more information for policymakers. And one of the most important things that we did was to allow it to replicate where we are today. So instead of simply saying, we want to be way up here, what we can say today is, here's where we are, and we have a lot of detail on where we are, how much we spend on various things, how well students are doing. And then we can use the model to say, how much does it cost to do various things, short of implementing the entire recommendations of the commission to get all the way up here, given that resources are scarce. What discrete policy initiatives can we undertake how much do they cost, and what are the expected consequences for student achievement of doing that. In that sense, the model becomes a very useful tool to understand the relative costs and benefits of different policy initiatives, and that's the way the Commission has been using the model for the last 7 or 8 years. Unfortunately, the law tells us what our legal charge is to estimate this big number, and it hasn't been a terribly useful exercise in that sense, but the model itself, I think, is a very powerful tool to help us understand what things cost and help us make the trade-offs that are really necessary when resources are scarce. I think while he's doing that, we can start in. I think you all have paper copies of the PowerPoint, so let's just use those. The second slide on the bottom of page 1 really paraphrases what the law says the charge of the Commission is, and that's to determine the amount of money required to meet our goals, our education goals as established in statute, to identify best practices, and then to issue this report that estimates what current practices are, how much it costs to do those, and what best practices are, and what it would cost to do that. And that second one, that big number, is right there in law and probably is not serving us well as an exercise.
So on that previous slide that showed that the gap was $2.95 billion for the current biennium, the dotted line is the resource it would take to get 90% of our students to meet our quality education goals. So what percentage of our students are meeting our quality education goals at the solid line at the bottom?
It varies by grade. The measure we typically use for performance is the percent meeting or exceeding the standards on our state assessments. It's one of the best measures we have that we can actually quantify. Mid to upper 60%. Lower grades a tad higher, although as you know, we've adjusted the benchmarks in the last couple of years. We've raised the benchmarks in grades 3 through 8, and so the percent of students meeting our standards has declined because of that adjustment. But we're in the 60s, upper 60s